Hello and welcome. In this series of videos, we've been considering the question of distributive justice, right? This is the question of what sorts of resources need to be held by whom? Are there situations where it's an injustice that certain people don't have enough, right? And one of the big questions that seems to be part of the cultural conversation still is the question of reparations, right? Does justice require us to transfer certain amounts of wealth or resources towards groups that have been historically oppressed in the past? So one first way we're going to look at this topic is to look at this paper by the philosopher J. Angelo Corlett called Reparations to Native Americans. Here's the plan for the paper. First, we'll start by looking at some of the facts about injustices that have been done towards Native American people. Native American is the term that Corlett uses. In some contexts, I might also say indigenous North American people, but oftentimes in the notes, we'll stick with Corlett's terminology. We'll ask the question of what the point of reparations is, right? We will see the main motivations, and then we'll consider Corlett's argument in favor of reparations. Now, this argument comes pretty early in the paper, and it will come pretty early in this presentation. And I've noticed that in many practical ethics papers, you'll find this structure. You lay out some facts, you give a basic argument early on, where we say, well, here are the facts, and we see that X is sufficient to justify Y, right? And in this way, we have a main argument that's out on the table, and then we consider, for the remainder of the paper, possible reasons why somebody might tell you that X isn't actually sufficient to justify Y. So they might say that Y is not entailed by X for reasons A, B, and C, and then what the philosopher will do for the remainder of the paper is to say why A doesn't work as an objection, B doesn't work, C doesn't work. So we will consider some, but not all, of the objections to Corlett's approach that he considers and then offers rebuttals to. So that's where we're going for today. First, let's just take some time to think about the historical facts. And I think that the basics of these historical facts are well known and are not philosophically controversial, right? And here's what I think is the uncontroversial part that any historian worth listening to will agree to in its basic forms, is that grave injustices have been committed against Native Americans in the past. And good examples of these grave injustices includes seizures of land that were not justified. We can also talk about the ways in which various treaties have been broken. We can talk about unjustified violence, horrifying violations of people's bodies and homes and families. And we can also talk about cultural imperialism. That indigenous culture has not been shown understanding or respect. So if you need to learn more about these things, you might even just take a bit of time to learn about situations like the Wounded Knee Massacre, right? Or you might learn about many of the intentionally harmful things that former President Andrew Jackson did to indigenous people. You might also, getting more close to the present, read up on and learn about American Indian boarding schools. In these situations, indigenous children were taken away from their families with the express intent of teaching them Christian religion and teaching them the English language, and with an intent to remove the cultures that these kids were receiving from their families. I, as a Canadian citizen, have learned more about the Canadian boarding school system, also known as the system of residential schools. And one thing that you will learn is that these schools were designed for that express intent of erasing indigenous culture and to promote Christianity. And we can see that as a clear example of cultural imperialism. But within the Canadian system, and I understand that this is roughly similar in the American system, these schools were also the sites of just incomprehensibly horrible abuse that these children suffered, both in terms of sexual abuse and in terms of physical abuse, which sometimes led to death. In the Canadian system, they have been finding massive mass graves outside of these residential schools because of the widespread abuse and mistreatment of these children. So I think that these sorts of events make it indisputable that injustice has been done to Indigenous people. Think back to Iris Marion Young and the Five Faces of Oppression. She tells us that people can be seen as oppressed when they suffer from exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence, right? And it's easy to see how Indigenous North Americans have been systematically subjected to all of these five faces of oppression. I will give one recommendation for further reading, and it's a book by a Canadian-American author named Thomas King. His book is called The Inconvenient Indian, and in it, he shows that there are a lot of misconceptions about Indigenous people still up to the present, and an important part of righting the wrongs of the past is to understand the truth. Now, this book, The Inconvenient Indian, was also made into a documentary film by the Canadian National Film Board. Looking around on the internet, there are ways to find it for free and legally and easily. So I might recommend that if you are keen to take these issues of injustices done towards Indigenous people in the past, and also looking at where there are opportunities for self-advocacy and a more just future, you might look at either this book or this film. Now, one suggestion that's made about the way forward is to talk about reparations. Right? So what is the function of reparations? Well, Corlett notes that in many cases, just like with criminal punishment, not only is there the consequence of a certain policy, but we can also understand reparations, also punishment, in terms of their expressive functions. So when we talk about the expressive function of something, we're talking about what it does to say something, right? And when we perform reparations, what are we saying? Well, the first thing that we say is that something wrong was done, right? That in the past, we did not live up to the aims, standards, and values of our society. So that would be the first thing said by reparations. And furthermore, when we give reparation, not only do we say it was wrong, but we say that is not who we want to continue to be. So we alienate ourselves from certain past actions and values, right? And when you own your past wrongs, it also offers an apology. So it gives a certain kind of acknowledgement to those who have been oppressed and victimized. So this is a function that might be served by an act of reparation, as Corlett is thinking about it. And with this sort of function in mind, he then gives what he would see as the central argument in favor of reparations. So here's the first point. It's that, one, clear historic rights violations morally ought to be rectified, and as much as humanly possible by reparations. Now, this as much as humanly possible qualifier says that, look, the kind of repair that is necessary needs to be in correlation with the kind of harm done. We want the fix to be proportional to the wrong, right? And so the clearer the rights violation, the stronger the case for reparation. And then here's the second one. If we are looking for examples of clear human rights violations, what was done to Native Americans is a clear example. Now, of course, there are other examples, like the example of chattel slavery, as it was practiced against African people unwillingly taken to America to be enslaved, right? But taking that separately, we can say that what was done to indigenous people is clearly an example of a rights violation. And if we say that any rights violation is sufficient to justify giving as much reparation as possible, we would say that the U.S. government morally ought to pay reparations to Native Americans. And how much? As much as they can, given the gravity, seriousness, and obviousness of the wrongness done to them. So, now that we've got the argument on the table, let's consider some of the arguments from historical complexity. One thing that we might say, and that some people have said, is that we see the general point that when a wrong is done, we need to pay it back. But some people have said, like, look, the historic details of the injustices against Native Americans are too complex to serve as the basis of determinate reparations claims. So we might notice, for instance, that maybe there's a distinction that can be drawn between how Native Americans are doing nowadays, but we don't know how they would be doing if historic wrongs had not been done to them. And we don't know whether certain actions were the U.S. government acting, or was it Andrew Jackson acting unilaterally. And all of these questions sort of point to the question of how we can fully understand what happened in the past. Now, Corlett will respond. He says, we don't need to know all the details about exactly who was harmed and in exactly what ways. He's going to point out that what we do know is that the lands inhabited by most Americans or owned by the U.S. federal government were, for the most part, stolen from Native Americans. So even if we don't know exactly how well off or badly off Native Americans would be if these wrongs had not been committed, we do know that there was a theft. And he's going to say that that's enough to justify. Now, at this point, he brings in Nozick. When Nozick gave us the theory of entitlements, right, he said one thing that we should notice is that we want to think about transfers of goods in terms of just transfers. Once we have something originally appropriated, then we want to make sure that all the further transfers of those goods are done through legal, consensual, contractual means. Right? And he's going to say, in that context, if there's a right way of transferring goods, he's also going to say, whatever is acquired or transferred by morally unjust means will itself then be an unjust holding. So, for instance, if I come to have $100 in my wallet, but only by stealing it out of your wallet, well, that just isn't my $100. And even if I then, use that to buy something nice, I don't know, let's say I use it to buy a beautiful vintage table, we might say that because I bought it with tainted money, that too is unjust. right? And the fact that I've owned something for a long time, or that I kept the theft hidden for a long time, Corlett is going to go along with Nozick and say, like, look, a stolen good can never become rightly held, and it doesn't matter how many trades or transfers. If the original acquisition was unjust, whatever you eventually turned that acquisition into will also be unjust. So that's the first thing. We don't need to know everything. We just need to know that there was a theft. Here's a second objection. This second objection says it would be problematic to hold the current U.S. government and the current citizens of the U.S. as morally responsible for wrongs committed by previous generations. Because we might think that, basically nobody alive today was alive when Andrew Jackson implemented the Trail of Tears, killing numerous Native American people and dispossessing them of their land in the process. We might think, why should we hold the Trump administration responsible for what the Jackson administration did? Or why should we hold we residents of America as responsible for fixing the problem that our great-great-great-grandfathers created? That's the question, right? Can we hold a collective responsible for something that was undertaken by certain individuals and also by a group of individuals which might, in some sense, be said to no longer exist? But Corlett is going to disagree here. He's going to say that, if you look at the U.S. government, the governing documents of the United States have largely stayed the same, right? We still have the same legal entity, the United States of America, nowadays, as we had in the 19th century when Jackson was president, right? And in this way, we might say there continues to be an entity called the U.S. government, right? We can think about other groups that might be with interchangeable or evolving sets of members. Think about your favorite sports team, whether it be, the New York Yankees in baseball or the Edmonton Oilers in hockey. The players on the teams nowadays is not going to be the same set of players on the team that they had 20 years ago. Right? And it might even be that the owners and the management are different on these teams. But we might say that, even, the present-day Edmonton Oilers, giving a hockey example and a team that I follow, we still say that the current entity has to its record 5 championships, right? And in this way, we would say that there are honors and also failures that are attached to a certain group with members that haven't existed as long as the group as a whole. And maybe every member of the group hasn't existed as long as the group as a whole. We're going to say that in a similar way, the U.S. government, through the evolution of its interrelated parts, has remained the same institution. And thus, we could still hold this principle of morally just and unjust acquisitions and transfers to the goods held by the U.S. government. Just one more example, we might also notice that the current U.S. government still holds debts for loans taken out by previous formations of the government. You can't get out of a debt simply by saying, well, we've changed too many of our parts, or that those loans were taken out by individuals, not the collective. Furthermore, Corlett is going to say we shouldn't think that there's a statute of limitations on justice. Now, in law, for various reasons, if you commit certain kinds of crime, like even fraud or theft, if you are not caught, charged, and tried within a certain amount of time, let's say 20 years, we would say we are not going to prosecute that anymore. Now, there are practical legal reasons, especially in terms of evidence, that make it hard to avoid statutes of limitations in the criminal law. But when we're thinking about justice in general, and especially for wide-scale, grave historical wrongs, we don't necessarily need to think that there's a statute of limitations. So if we ask the rhetorical question, should we think that there's a statute of limitations on justice? Corlett is going to say, we should instead think that a burden of reparation would remain until that very injustice does come to be addressed. All right, let's look at one last objection. And we might think that this is a utilitarian-inspired objection, right? And it basically says making reparation to Native Americans, that would make society worse. It would be too costly. It would be too hard. Here's how Corlett responds. He says, it might be really hard. It might be really bad. But justice isn't just about utilitarian cost-benefit analysis. Whether or not the results are good, justice is justice. And when clear injustices have been done, that creates a duty of reparation. That's how Corlett thinks it through. And as he says it, he's sort of embracing perhaps an implausible conclusion, but in another way, we might think that Corlett is courageously sticking to his guns on this argument. He's saying that this mode of reparation would most likely dissolve the United States as we know it. It seems like in order to pay these reparations, the U.S. would have to pay so much that it would no longer be able to function as a government, right? We would just run out of resources in paying back the Native American community. But he continues, but perhaps the United States, insofar as it was founded on the clear, repeated, intentional violations of the content of principle, morally just acquisitions and transfers, because it violated that principle, it deserves to be dissolved in favor of taking much more seriously than it currently does morality and justice. So in this way, we might just have to start completely over, is Corlett's suggestion. Maybe one way of doing this would be to find representatives of each Native American tribe. We would give property rights in all the land and all territorial jurisdiction back to them. And we would then have to look at all other immigrants within the country as visitors required to pay rents to these tribes. And that would be costly, but as Corlett says, maybe even though it's costly, it would be the right thing to do. Now, Corlett does consider towards the end of this chapter, he says there might be ways of making reparations that don't decrease social utility. So for instance, instead of paying a massive amount of reparations, maybe we should just pay like 1% of everybody's income back to the Native American community for a certain amount of time. And that would be doable, it would be costly, and it would be a large gesture. But Corlett says maybe that sort of gesture isn't enough. Maybe it's inadequate. We might think that just as we look at lawsuits where a person is paid sometimes thousands or millions of dollars for trauma and emotional harm, it would be an insult to instead try to settle with that client for, a measly $5. We would say that that doesn't fit the level of reparation that really takes this seriously. So we might have like the 1% income diversion. Another diversion or another approach is what has been referred to as the Buffalo Commons approach to reparations. More or less, you'd take a large swath of land in the middle of the United States, think a bit east of Denver through the Great Basin. Not a lot of Americans live there, and it's not necessarily hugely important for American industry. But that land could be made the sovereign territory of indigenous peoples. That might, again, give indigenous people something, but we might find that as a form of reparation too convenient, too self-serving for the non-indigenous community. And as I put it before, we might consider that sort of reparation as light and measly, right? So it seems that Corlett's main point here is that the broader lesson is that the pursuit of justice takes precedence over social utility. So just to sum up, Corlett thinks that injustices towards Native Americans should justify a payment of reparation. And we considered some of the objections to this line of thought: historical complexity, collective responsibility, and social utility. I'll leave with one reflection. If Corlett were here in the room with me, here's what I would ask him about. And it's the point about the function served by reparation, right? That it simply needs to acknowledge a wrong done, that the perpetrator should alienate themselves to it, and they should offer a genuine statement of apology to those who were wronged. Acknowledge those who were wronged. That seems to be one line of thought that he gives. He also appeals to this line of thought that says, well, if land was stolen, it should never be stolen, and we need to have a large payment to fit the crime. Now, I think that those are two different strands of thought. And I wonder if somebody could be in favor of reparations for these communicative purposes, where we say something wrong was done and we want to make things right and move forward in a more just mode of society. It doesn't seem obvious to me that this means that we should pay as much as we can, or till it hurts, or until social utility is completely depleted. We might think that those are two separate lines of thought. And we could ask Corlett, what is the most important thing? Is it the expressive function of reparation, or is it about making the payment of reparation directly proportional to the size of the injustice done? Now, I think that there are a number of different ways we could go here, but it seems that towards the end of the paper, Corlett is taking that latter view, that we need to make sure that for terrible injustices, extreme reparation should be pursued. And with that in mind, I'll leave it to you to reflect on how compelling Corlett's sort of strong proposal that we should give until it hurts. We might even need to give to the point of dissolving the United States as we know it. So thanks for listening. As always, if you have any thoughts, concerns, or questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Take care.